How's everyone doing? Let me just pull up the chat here. Awesome. I'm doing okay. No complaints. Just a reminder that next week we don't have a lecture because of reading week / family day. Perfect. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the 5th lecture for human motor control and learning. In today's lecture, we're going to be discussing sort of the different variables that have been analyzed when evaluating motor performance or motor performance while doing different motor skills. And so what we're going to look at is some of the different motor skills that have been researched and what has been sort of figured out about how those skills are influenced by the 3 factors of the environment, the person, and the skill itself, how those factors influence our ability to complete different motor skills. And then we'll finish up with talking about action preparation. Now, I wanted to say that, again, this lecture, just like the previous lecture, they're pretty content heavy. And so what I want to reiterate for those of you that are here today, and as well those individuals that are going to be watching the recording, is that I'm going to be presenting the most sort of important information to give a good flow in terms of understanding the material. What I would want you to do is sort of focus on that while watching the recording, getting a good idea of the parts of the lecture from start to finish, and then going back into the lecture slides and sort of reading around the main points, and then trying to have the general knowledge and then building on it with sort of the different examples that are in the slides. Now remember, all testing is taken from the lecture slides, and so that's why I wanted most of the information to be on there. So that way, if you do miss the lecture or just like to prefer to read the slides, it would have all the information that you require to succeed in the course. So like I said, the outline of today's lecture is we're going to be looking at sort of the principles of motor control in various different motor skills and what research has sort of analyzed or figured out. And then we're going to be discussing action preparation, or what happens in the time before we start to initiate movement. What part of processing is required, and how do we research that? So let's first start off by commenting on what was been seen and discussed a lot in this course, but what had been sort of noticed in early motor control research, this whole idea of a speed accuracy trade-off. We see that most errors occur when we are trying to complete something quickly. And that's true in motor skills, but also in real life with multitasking. This suggests, or the speed accuracy trade-off suggests, that a performance emphasis on accuracy will reduce movement speed. So if we tell someone to start doing something accurately, typically what happens is that the speed of movement tends to decrease. And why could that be? What would be one reason why that would occur? Think back to our body's ability in terms of control to work within an open or closed loop system. Yes, that's absolutely correct, Karen. So by going slower, we can maximize the use of feedback to make minute adjustments and therefore make our movement more accurate. So the converse of that in the speed accuracy trade-off would be that when we have a task emphasis on speed or wanting to do something quickly, we reduce the accuracy of the performance. So that was something that had been noticed in, remember, early research was all sort of cognitive, behavioral, and psychological evaluations. And so that was something that had been noticed in all different types of motor skills. And so early research wanted to look at specifically that sort of concept, because it would give us an idea of sort of the motor control processes that were running behind the scenes. So in 1954, so this is even before kinesiology was a program, there was a study that wanted to sort of demonstrate this speed accuracy trade-off using math. And so what they did was Paul Fitts was the researcher, and what he did is he designed this apparatus or setup where you would have a participant having to take a metal stylus and tap targets, or there were metal plates, back and forth. And then what they did in the study was that they wanted to decrease the target size, and therefore having to increase accuracy, and change the distance between the targets, and see if they could come up with a mathematical sort of definition to, or a mathematical law to try and predict changes in movement speed based on different accuracy emphasis. So by doing that study and by figuring out, what the movement time was and how it changed when you reduced the target size and the distance of the targets, they were able to come up with an actual mathematical equation to predict speed or movement time in that study. And so the benefit of this study was that it gave sort of a mathematical analysis of difficulty. So the Fitts law equation from the study was a mathematical law to predict how long it would take the participant to go from one target to another based on the target size and how far apart they were from each other. But what came from the equation was this logarithmic sort of index here. This would sort of judge the difficulty of the task based on the width of the targets and the distance between the two targets. So this became a sort of mathematical way to indicate this speed accuracy trade-off. The part of the equation that is sort of the logarithmic part is called the index of difficulty. So this was a way to grade the difficulty of different targets and infer how their movement speed would be affected. So you'll see this probably on a midterm. You won't have to memorize the equation, but know that the index of difficulty is a way to logarithmically sort of indicate the difficulty using the distance between the targets, so that's d, distance, and the width of the targets. So when we have smaller targets, or the targets are further away from each other, based on this part of the equation, movement time would increase, or the difficulty would increase. So here we have an example of, you would have to do the calculations. So Karen's asking, do we need to understand the formula, but not do the calculations? No, you would want to be able to do the calculation, understanding that W is the width of the target and D is the distance between the two. So look at this example here. This is describing different indexes of difficulties based on those two measures. So here we have an index of difficulty of 3. So let's say that I'm a participant and I'm moving a stylus between these two targets. It's off a computer screen, but imagine it was on a paper. So here we have targets that are 1 centimeter width and they're 4 centimeters apart. So based on that equation, it would be an index of difficulty of 3. Now watch this. If we take the targets and increase the size to 2 centimeters, so see how these targets are bigger, but they're further apart. They are 8 centimeters apart from each other. If you plug those numbers into the equation, it also gives us an index of difficulty of 3. So based on that equation that was sort of demonstrated and put together, these two target size difference ratios would equal the same difficulty in terms of our motor control. But look at it this way. So if we take these targets are both 2 centimeters apart from each other. These targets are 2 centimeters in width. This target is 1 centimeter in width. So even though they're the same distance apart, so imagine someone moving in between with a stylus, because these targets are bigger, based on the equation, it would be an index of difficulty of 1. These targets are smaller, so plugging that into the equation gives us an index of difficulty of 2. So based on the equation, this movement would be more difficult than this movement. Does that make sense, everyone? Am I going too fast? So the benefit of this was that it allowed for the first step of trying to apply math or sort of a law or analysis to sort of a motor control observation. So they could use this index of difficulty and try and predict the difficulty of different types of tasks. This one was a pointing task, so a manual aiming task, but maybe this gives us a sort of mathematical equation that would be true for all types of motor skills. And then you could figure out how you could sort of grade the difficulty of those. And so what happened moving forward from that research was that lots of different motor types, motor skills were used in rehab, sports, and sort of daily life setting, and also stayed true to Fitt's law. Now, different motor skills don't use distance and width measurements, and so each skill that you study has to use sort of different measurements, but generally you can develop an index of difficulty equation when evaluating the changes in movement time when changing difficulty. And so things that have been looked at were like dart throwing, moving a cursor. So this is a rehab setting. So what about bigger targets that are further apart versus smaller targets that are closer together? It would be nice to know what's difficult versus what would be easier, because that will allow for a better progression when rehabbing stroke patients. And so we've talked about in stroke patients, you're trying to rehab daily life stuff. So moving and manipulating objects. And so this is what a pegboard is. I don't know if any of you, I think there's a couple of you that work in sort of a rehab setting. And so maybe you've seen that. This picture here is looking at sort of evaluating the difficulty and practice of reaching and grasping containers of different sizes. So if you look closely when you zoom in and you have the slides by yourself, you can see how there's different sort of like different containers that are all different sizes. And so maybe you would be able to rate which of the containers would be more difficult, so you could progress rehab in a like sort of like stepwise fashion. The principles of this whole idea of Fitt's law is used in technology. And so based on sort of the idea of index of difficulty, you would say that more frequent tasks should be positioned closer to the average position, right? Because difficulty increases as there's distances further apart. So things you do the most often should be closer to the middle, and we see that with technology, consoles, phones. And then tasks that are done more frequently should also be larger. So to make something easier, you increase the size and you bring them closer together. So basically applications of that law have been applied to our use of technology. Now this is, this is old, this is like 20 years old now, but even when using apps, if you can look at the buttons and the different sort of setups under our different apps, they hold true to this. Can anyone think of any other examples? For sure, video games. I'm not sure how, but like the controller, you have bigger buttons, right? Maybe even like when you're like changing your weapons on whatever games you're playing and stuff. Maybe it's, I don't know, like there's got to be tons of ways that is utilized. So like when you like your menu, right? Things that are done more frequently or that you need to change are going to be bigger and held right there. I don't know. So remember, we had talked about how when evaluating motor control, we need to understand and account for the fact that the body can work in both an open and closed loop system, right? When you're working in a closed loop system, that means your movement speed slows down so that we can utilize feedback. Do we all remember that from last day? And so one of the biggest reasons or variables as to whether or not our body can use a closed loop system was going to be based on what? There was a bunch that we came up with, but the main one. It's on the slide. It was time. And so if we have to move quickly, then there's not going to be an opportunity for us to slow down our movement and better utilize feedback. That was one example. The others were like whether something is discrete or continuous, or whether or not it's well learned. But right now we're talking about time is a big variable as to whether or not we can work in an open or closed loop system. And so when evaluating these manual aiming tasks, reaching and pointing, just like the stylus, and that was what the index of difficulty equation was developed for, we're looking at and considering that at movement initiation. So if I decide I want to reach and point at something, so imagine me pointing at this screen or in the study pointing at a stylus, our eyes are going to look at the target, and then our brain is going to calculate, okay, look at the target, calculate distance, size of the target, and sort of get a better idea of what are the parameters for that movement, and then we'll initiate movement. So we could potentially, if we have to do it quickly, we could work in an open loop system where the brain is going to process all of that sensory information, add it to the motor program, and then we move. If we want to move accurately and enough time is available, then as we slow down our movement, we'll be able to get feedback from proprioception, vision, and maybe touch to let's say we missed the target and we got to move over. That would be touch, for example. We can utilize the feedback, whichever one it is, to adjust our movements in real time. We discussed that at the end of the lecture. Vision is primary. So vision tends to supersede all of our different senses. So when evaluating just manual aiming tasks, let's look at how vision is utilized in the preparation phase, in the initial flight stage, and in termination. So studies looked at like sort of if they could find different variables that were consistent between people that were doing manual aiming tasks, reaching and pointing specifically. And so what they found was that in the preparation phase, whatever we're going to point to, right, whatever the target is, our eyes have to look. So what would be sort of important would be our eyes looking at the target. And central vision, do we all remember the difference between central vision and peripheral vision? So what does central vision do versus what does peripheral vision do? Or what are they responsible for? Peripheral vision was important at picking up movement in our periphery, whereas central vision was going to give our high definition of information, or high definition of what we're specifically looking at. And so when looking or evaluating this manual aiming task or reaching and pointing, we're going to look at the target, and our central vision is going to give us size, shape, distance, and sort of the appropriate important information that's going to be added to our motor program before we initiate movement. As we initiate movement, right, we've decided, okay, this is where we go, and then we initiate movement. We have the fact that if we are moving too fast, then the body would move in an open loop system. All that information from central vision would have been processed prior to movement, and then it would have been completed. if we are trying to move accurately, what happens is that our peripheral, so as we move to reach for the target, we're going to look at the target, and that's going to help us establish tau, or time to contact, based on the relative change of size. Our sort of body or brain can process estimated time to contact. Peripheral vision is going to monitor our movement. And so this is interesting. So everyone look at the screen. So imagine, I don't know, like imagine the start button or something in the corner. Imagine you want to reach and touch the corner. So just go and do that. What you're going to see is that your eyes focus to the corner, and you're noticing your movement of your arm with your peripheral vision. You notice it, and it's letting you know about movement, but our eyes are focused on the target. We have to focus our eyes on the target specifically at 50% of movement time, because we need to judge time to contact. We don't process mathematically our estimated time. It's all sort of like a reaction based on the relative change of size of the image. And then at the termination phase of a reaching and pointing task, visualizing the target is going to let us know about whether or not we are about to hit the target, and we can make minute adjustments. So in a simple reaching and pointing task, this is what vision is going to provide for us. Does that make sense? And I bring this up because there is central vision and peripheral vision, sort of high def, and then movement feedback. But we're going to see that vision does this for all the different tasks we're going to look at next. So prehension is the next skill we're going to look at. So then research wanted to look at, okay, so we come up with some ideas, movement speed, sort of the factors of what vision provides when a simple reaching and pointing task. What happens if it's not reaching and pointing, but reaching and grasping and manipulating an object? That's called prehension. So reaching and grasping an object to manipulate it. So you're not just touching, you're going to pick up the object and do something with it. So picking up a cup and drinking out of it would be a prehension task. Picking something up and manipulating it, prehension. And so research looked at, okay, well, maybe what are some of the variables that are involved with the same sort of timestamps? Transport, grasp, and instead of target touching, manipulation. And so what they found immediately was that the intended use of the object influences the way that we move. And so initially when they were looking at this, they were going to say, okay, so if I am going to reach up a cup and drink out of it, is that one motor skill of reaching and touching, and then the next motor skill is grasping and drinking? And the reason why it's not is because, watch this, if you go to reach for something, so reach for something small, reach for something big, your intended use of the object that you're grasping for influences how you move. So if someone is reaching for a cup, they're immediately going to they're going to move like this. If they're going to reach for a hammer, like this. Scissors, they start doing this. So reaching for and manipulating an object is the skill itself. It can't be separated into two individual things of reaching and then object manipulation. It's all combined because, try it, practice it. When you go to reach for a cup, like a mug, you're instantly processed how you're going to move your hand based on the intended use of the object you're going to be grasping for. Can we all agree on that? So when you're rehabbing people that have lost the ability to, sort of manipulate objects because of a stroke, for example, this means that you don't just teach them how to reach and point. You can start, but with the return to daily life, they have to get used to developing the skills of how to reach and grasp for different objects. Practice picking up this hammer. Practice picking up these scissors and moving them around. Other things that sort of like mathematics that they found when evaluating prehension tasks, that the size of the object will influence the timing of the maximum grip. So I don't know if you guys noticed this, but I drink a lot extra large coffees. I don't know where it all fits, but that's what I get. And because it's so big, so when you go to reach for something that's big, your hand opens up faster. Whereas if it's something small, what they've noticed is that people will start to open their hand more closer to the object. Grip closure tends to start occurring at 2/3 of movement time. So you open your hand and then you will start grasping like the target or whatever your object you're reaching for at around 2/3 of movement time. And so this was an interesting study. So if you here's the cup. Let's say it's on a table, and then participant blindfolded, open your eyes, grab for the whatever object. They see it, they go to grab for it, right? So this is like it's motion, it's already moving. If they move the object mid-stance, the whole thing resets. So if I go and I'm going to reach for the cup and I'm starting to close, and then I move the target, it's the whole motor skills reset. It's not that I move the hand and then like re-grasp. It's one skill. I hope I'm doing a good job of explaining that. Does that make sense, everyone? Awesome. So when evaluating vision and its role in a reaching and grasping task or prehension, it would do the same sort of thing. So in preparation of movement, you would look at the object and it would give us an idea of distance, size, maybe weight, and how your hand would conform with that object. During transport, so once that's put together, it's going to be the parameters are going to be put on the motor program, and then we're going to execute and initiate movement. Once we're initiating movement, our peripheral vision is going to notice limb displacement or if anything's moving in the periphery, but our eyes are going to be focused on the object so we can get time to contact. And then when we grasp the object, in this case, we have touch now. So we can feel, or we'll have that feedback from touch, and then vision is going to be making sure about what we're looking. So vision is going to be looking and confirming from our tactile feedback that we've grasped and manipulated the object appropriately. And as you get better, right, you don't need to look at the object to ensure you're doing it correctly. We're better used to utilizing our proprioception. So the big thing from this research, which was kind of huge, is that the reaching and manipulating an object is the one motor skill. So when we're teaching people to go back into daily life stuff and manipulate the objects like a comb, a toothbrush, a mug to drink out of, their tie, you have to do all of those individually. Cool, right? So we had talked about handwriting last day and this whole idea of motor equivalence. And so we have the motor program of our hand cursive writing style, or cursive writing style, I guess, or handwriting, even though if we use our other hand or feet or teeth, that's sort of like the parameter, sorry, the invariant features of the writing structure is what is downloaded in our brain. So our body demonstrated a coordinative structure in that no matter what limb we used, the writing will look similar. But what about vision and the feedback of writing? Do we need to look at what we're writing, or do we not? So what I want someone to do, or you can all do this, take a piece of paper and you're going to write on a piece of paper, I like to sit and read books. You can, okay? So write it at the top, move it down. Now close your eyes and write it 5 more times. because then you're going to do a little experiment with yourself as to what vision is important for when writing. Let me know when someone has completed that task. Anyone do it? So it should look something like this. Yes. So Tyler's right. So what you noticed like this was that vision seems to be necessary to make sure you're writing on the same line, so that like its location stays consistent. The other thing is that, did you notice that sometimes you spelt differently, or you would omitted or added extra letters? Vision tends to give you feedback as to what you're writing, so that way you're more accurate. What about, okay, so now we've looked at handwriting. Let's look at another skill. What about bimanual coordination skills? Have you all heard that term before? So bimanual coordination skills are those skills that involve utilizing two hands at once. Bimanual coordination. You have to coordinate both hands to complete the motor skill. There's two different types. There's symmetric bimanual coordination, and that is a motor skill where both hands are doing the same thing, like rowing a boat, pushing a wheelchair. Anything else you guys think of? Skiing, maybe? Not really similar, potentially. An asymmetric bimanual coordination skill is when you're utilizing both hands, but they're both doing different things. So like playing a guitar, serving, playing the piano, maybe. So which do you think is more difficult for the brain? Yes. Asymmetrical is more difficult because then we have to utilize our supplementary motor cortex to ensure that both hands are doing a different program. So try this. Take that same piece of paper, flip it over, and now what I want you to do is try and draw a circle with the left hand. I can't even do it. And a triangle with the right hand at the same time, and see what happens. So take your hands, two pens, draw a circle, make a triangle, and now do it at the same time. Tell me what happens. It's weird. Your body has a hard time doing it. Initially, what happens is that your body wants to have both hands do the same thing. Because having the hands work independently is almost like having one program switch into two, and then you have to have your supplementary motor cortex coordinate both hands at once, doing different things. So what you notice is as you do that, limb speed slows down. So that way, so you could draw a circle quick, and the triangle is harder to do, right? So the triangle is slower when you're doing the movement. Your hands slow down for the more difficult task. And then whatever you're drawing, so the circle, I probably bet, started to look like a triangle, because initially you're trying to mimic the more difficult one. The majority of your processing power or attention has been put on the more difficult task. So then what happens is that you can train yourself to do it over time. You have an increased role of proprioception and feedback. You do it slower, and then you start speeding it up. And then you can somehow, with your supplementary cortex, disconnect that the hands have to work in the same fashion. Interesting, right? What did you guys notice when doing that? So that's an example of how the less difficult, the circle, was looking like the more difficult, the triangle. So think about research, right? Just a simple skill like that. What can you infer about what I've already just said it, but Tyler, you are noticing exactly what they notice. So what can you infer by that? Oh, well, clearly the brain wants to do the more difficult one and is slowing down for that. So the next thing that we're going to look at that they studied was catching a moving object. So catching a moving object is similar to reaching and grasping. Oh, so once we have a question. Tyler, why does it choose the harder shape? It's because the brain has to try, because remember, the goal is to complete this motor skill. So the brain is focusing most on the more difficult task to complete it. It's like if you were doing multitasking and you got to get everything done, you're going to focus on the one that's more difficult. It's going to take more effort. Yeah. So with catching a moving object, it's much like reaching and grasping. However, instead of reaching and grasping, the object is coming towards you. So in this case, the phases of that motion would be looking at the object, anticipating where it's going to be, moving your hand and arm to that position, shaping the hand, and then grasping it as it comes in. So what do you think vision is going to be important for with reaching and grasping? We've talked about this, but yes, exactly, Avery. Distance. So imagine an object coming to you. Someone's going to throw a baseball. Hey, heads up, right? Do you look up? Here comes an object at you. You're going to look at the object with your central vision. That's going to give us distance, size, shape, movement pattern. It's going to give us an estimation of where the object is going to go. So we would move our hand to that location. And then just prior to contact, you're going to look at the object. It's going to give us our timing, and then you're going to reach your hand around the object. So think about any baseball players in the class? Okay. So when we're playing baseball, everyone think of people in the outfield, right? Just, I don't know, watch the Blue Jays. You're going to see the ball hit the bat, and so they're looking at it. Then they run to the spot. Then they look up and time to contact. So vision is very important in the initial portion to look at the object initially and get an idea of where it's going to go and give you that information. And then vision is important prior to catching because you need central vision to give you the timing of when it's going to make impact. So between the two critical periods of initial flight and just prior to contact, vision of the object isn't actually necessary as much. Does that make sense, everyone? Central vision, time to contact. It's going to give us all our high-def information. And so you would need it initially to figure out where the object's, to make an estimate of where the object's going to go. And you need it at the end to time when to catch. What about vision of the actual, so let's say I'm looking at a ball. Do I need to see vision of my hand to catch the object? And so what they did was they did a study where they would have blinders where the participant wouldn't be able to see their hand. And what they found was that vision of the hand was necessary in inexperienced participants, but as you got better and better, then you wouldn't need vision as much. You could rely better on proprioceptive ability, so you wouldn't need peripheral vision to give you an estimation of where your hand is located as you're looking at the ball. And so what they did was they did this one study that proved that without vision of the hand, it was unsuccessful catches were as a result of positioning inaccuracy, and then with vision of the hand. So you're still looking at the ball. This is just if you can see your hand in the periphery. The errors were due to grasping errors. So let me show you the study right here. So what they did was they got amateurs and pros, or like people that were experienced and inexperienced in catching. And then what they did was they made them catch a number of balls or catches, and then they would remove vision of the hand. So they would use blinders so they couldn't see their hand. And so they would look at, if they missed the ball, why? What would happen? Would it fall? Would the ball hit their hands, or would they just miss the ball? And so what they found was this. So you can look at the difference in the results. So here we have experienced and inexperienced people. And so out of 20, they did a ratio. People that were experienced catchers would basically catch all of the balls, whereas people with inexperienced would still catch like 15 out of every 20 when they had vision of the hand. If they lost the vision of the hand, they would lose accuracy, but we still saw the ratio where the experienced would catch more than the inexperienced. And so what they looked at was the specific errors in the next slide, or the next part of the chart. And what we see here is that, so we have positioning error or grasping error. Positioning error is when you miss the ball. Grasping error is when it would hit your fingers. So you grasp incorrectly or the wrong timing, or with positioning, you just missed the ball. And so what they found was that when you had vision of your hand, the majority of the reason why you missed the ball was that you didn't time correctly. So you had the ball hitting your fingers and falling. Grasping error for both experienced and inexperienced. But when you had no vision of the hand, look at the percentage of the error was involved when in positioning. So therefore, based on this study, vision of the hand is necessary for sort of giving you feedback on your hand position. Essential vision is utilizing the time to contact. So it's already used up. Very interesting. What about striking a moving object? So they were looking at baseball players again, and they wanted to look at, okay, so if you were going to strike a different object, okay, think of it this way. So if you're catching a ball, then you would just need to look at the ball and when it's estimatingly going to estimate when it's going to contact your hand, and you would reach and grasp it in sort of the variables that we talked about in the previous slide. What about if you're striking a moving object? So like a baseball player with a baseball bat hitting a ball. If the speed of the pitch coming towards you is faster or slower, think of like the movement of swinging a baseball. Does it mean that if this pitch is slower, do we swing slower, or do we time the swing to happen later, so that way it's the same swing, but we hit the ball at the right time? What do you guys think? Yes. So by analyzing the baseball players, what they found was that the swing was always the same speed. It was just the timing of when they initiated it. What they also sort of realized that if you analyze a professional versus an amateur baseball player, the head movement is what is significantly different in the pro. And if timing is the issue, that means we really need to be able to utilize our eyes for time to contact. We need to be able to see the ball so that we can time properly. What do baseball coaches always say? Stare at the ball, stare at the ball, stare at the ball. When you are, right, look at the ball when you're going to swing. It's for that time to contact. That's the sort of motor control perspective behind it. So if we look at the swings of these baseball players. I'm going to mute it because it's like funny music. If we look at these swings in slow-mo, we can see the whole body is moving, but the head is so stable. And from analyzing that, we can infer then that vision, if the head is staying still, vision must be so important in the ability to perform that motor skill well. Look at the body, but the head is so level the whole time. Boom. So if we're analyzing all these people that are really good at this motor skill, and one consistent feature between all of them versus amateurs is that their head doesn't move, why could that be? This can go on. This will go on for another 4 minutes. But yes, the answer that Karen just said is because they need to focus with their eyes. So by having a level head, they're able to better utilize vision, which in a lot of motor skills is preferential. And so this whole idea of keeping the head stable to best utilize vision, that's something we see consistently with other motor skills that require vision. Such as walking, for example. Like when that's the next motor skill, like locomotion, moving from one spot to another. What they've found in rehab settings is that people with like sort of neurological deficiencies or sort of limitations with disabilities of a certain limb based on an injuries that they've had, they will adopt a inefficient movement pattern if it means that their head stays stable. Now, in terms of a motor skill, remember we were talking about like reaching and grasping, prehension, catching moving objects, striking moving objects. The difference with motion is that it is a continuous skill. So it uses a central pattern generator. And so we haven't talked about that yet, but the central pattern generator, I don't know if you guys have learned it in intramovement neuroscience. You should have. But there is the network of interneurons that sort of account for the rhythm of motion or of walking. And so we don't have to consciously control that. It sort of just happens. And then we can, with a continuous skill, focus our attention of the motor skill on different things. So that part is a little bit different. But with analysis or studies of walking, they have also found that there's sort of a rhythm to it of the whole body. You can analyze the rhythm because what you find is that in sort of rehab cases, the rhythm is off. So if you can understand what the rhythm of normal walking should be, you can sort of like teach that or rehab that. And I mentioned this part here already, that with walking, because walking is important to be able to see where you're going. So it's important to see where you're going when you're walking. Pathological patients can adopt an inefficient moving pattern if it means that their head will stay level, because you need to be able to see where you're going primarily. So vision of the eyes, therefore, what is our eyes most importantly trying to pick out from the environment when we're walking them? And so typically what research has shown is that our central vision is making sure that we're staying on track with our pathway. And it's also most important at determining time to contact with objects that we're trying to contact or avoid. we had one really interesting study here by Lee et al. That was doing high jump. And so I don't know if anyone knows high jump or is familiar with it from watching the Olympics or track and field. But with high jump, the path that they take is always the same, right? So does that mean that the expert high jumpers, does their foot positions exactly the same each time? What they did was they analyzed a bunch of different participants and watched their kinematics to see with every trial how their kinematics were different. And what they found was that their stride length was consistent in all the different trials, except at the end, last 6 strides before they jumped, the length of their stride was variable. And so what they found was that the high jumpers would run and then look at the target just before they needed to jump to get a better time to contact estimate. And then they would adjust their stride length to make sure that they touched the target, and then they could jump. So in this case, vision was primary to ensure time to contact or contacting an object. In this case, wherever they jump. I don't know if it's a plate or a spot. Does that make sense, everyone? Am I going too fast? Are you feeling comfortable with the material that I'm presenting? I'm definitely going through the slides and sort of trying to make a good story. So that way, when you go back into the slides, you have like the sort of the backbone of the tree, and then you're going to fill in with the leaves. Awesome. Yeah, Ronald, I would agree with you. It is a lot, but I want it to make sense, and I'm trying to give the outline and the most important, so that way you can all be able to read around it later after you've sort of digested sort of the whole lecture. I find that in comparison with doing virtual teaching to in person, I find that, and maybe it's just me, but I find that the back and forth with the students is great. It's a lot. So then I can go off on tangents, and I want to make sure that we get the backbone. But always feel free. Always. So all I'm saying, sorry, is that I find the lectures are taking longer virtually than in person, which is interesting. As long as you're all good and we're all good, then I'm good and we can move forward. May I continue? Perfect. So what we're going to do now in the last third of the lecture is talk about action preparation. So we talked about reaction time, and action preparation is sort of what's going on as a term to describe, because it came from studies. The studies of action preparation is studies that are looking at what sort of processing is happening before we initiate movement. So when we decide to move, and then we initiate that movement and it continues to termination, where is the processing occurring? And it's happening right between intention and initiation. Action preparation, it was going to involve sort of the development and implementation of the motor program. So it's going to, action preparation is sort of, once we figure out what we want to do, we need to look at the target, or we need to sort of understand what movements are important. We need to look at what skill is required, look at the parameters added on top. That all processing is what's happening in action preparation. So studies wanted to look at, well, what are the variables that are occurring? And remember, we talked about it in the first day or second day, how reaction time was like the main sort of motor control sort of variable that was analyzed. It's because of this. The main initial research wanted to look at action preparation, and the best measure that they could utilize was reaction time. So now we're coming back to it. Cool? Do y'all remember that? So when evaluating reaction time, what researchers initially wanted to look at was all the different variables that would affect reaction time when performing a motor skill, because that will give us an idea of what is being processed and what is the most important when we're processing the information. So the first thing that they realized will influence our action preparation or reaction time was the number of response choices. Do we all remember Hicks' law? It was mentioned in that video. But what Hicks' law dictates is that our reaction time increases. So the time it takes from intention to initiation of movement is going to logarithmically increase based on the number of choices. Every time we add another option as to what can occur, then we have to decide or process which of the different responses is most appropriate for that setting. So each time you add another option of what you can do, you're increasing the processing required because you have to choose. You have to be like, oh, you know, not this one, not this one, not this one, this one. Send it out. Does that make sense, everyone? And I always show this video because it is it's a martial arts guy, and he's saying that basically, if you are like an expert in sort of fighting or martial arts, there's all these different moves that you can do, right? So if someone goes to punch you, how are you in a split second in your mind going to be like, okay, of the 1,000 different moves that I know, which one am I going to pick? So what he and other different sort of martial artists or combat people are taught is that you have to always think of one thing: dodge and then react, dodge and then react. So that way it decreases reaction time, because no matter what the assailant is going to do to attack you, it's initially the same reaction. So that would then motor control decrease reaction time.
There's one other component here that's huge, and that is Hicks' law, another scientific measure. Hicks' law basically says, I'm going to do layperson stuff because I'm not a scientist, that theoretically the fastest response time a human being can have is if there's one stimulus and one response choice. That if I add more choices, I slow down response time. And if I add more stimuli, I slow down response time exponentially. Now look at your defensive tactics manual, look at the average self-defense book. Our system has 4,000 moves. And I'm going, so you have no clue what to do in a fight, right? You know, and obviously there are exceptions. There are some genetic freaks out there. And I always tell people, don't mistake the trademark for the truth. Unless that person is your bodyguard, the fact that what their accomplishments demonstrate doesn't mean that that skill is transferable to every single student. Does that make sense? In our train the trainer classes, the first thing a prospective instructor writes down is, do not show your students what you can do, show your students what they can do. Cool? Because we all get into that. We learn our parlor tricks and we go, hey, and then people want to learn it, and it's dangerous. You need to demystify the whole process. Questions? So the Hicks law, it's great to have a scientific measure, but what's your demo? That's the theoretical, what's the empirical? Well, if I'm over here like this, Tony does, and we'll do this slowly because we don't have any gear on and I'm getting old. I'm talking to him, my hands are up, we all agree this is an instinctive natural position. Actually, you can do this fast. We'll go through a series of moves. He comes in with a haymaker. Okay, do you all see? I flinch, I push away danger. I'm standing in front of him, haymaker. This one you'll have to slow down. He comes at me with a headbutt. I flinch, I push away danger. He comes at me with a left hook. I flinch, I push away danger. He comes at me to tackle me. I flinch, I push away danger. He comes at me, but he tackles this side. I flinch, I push away danger. The flinch is ambidextrous. If I say look out over here, your hands will come up. If somebody says look out over here, my hands will come up. Okay? Because you're all police officers, I'm standing here talking to the guy with his right hand with my right hand, I'm going to point to your left hand, but thank you for mortifying me in the class. I meant your correct hand. Oh, the correct. I hope that was real, Andy. Okay, so here we are with his correct hand, his left hand. He's going to lunge at my gun. Watch this, guys. There's the flinch and push away danger. How much, listen up, how much more significant is incorporating the flinch there, pushing away danger, than having a skill set that says your move starts when he has your gun? Talk about vicarious liability. Standing here talking to the guy with his right hand he grabs, and I still flinch. Do you see Hicks' law here? It doesn't matter what he does, I'm doing one move. One move. There's one other component here that's huge.
Oops. So does that make sense, everyone? Interesting video, sort of in a clinical or real life application of a motor control theory. Okay, so another thing that was sort of realized was that if you had like different choices, right? There was so let's say there was a response of like 4 or 5 different options, and so you would measure the reaction time required for it. So that would be a larger reaction time than just one response. If you were given a hint, so in the time where the sort of like you were going to be told, okay, this is the response, this is the stimulus, and then it requires this response. If you were given a hint prior, it would decrease the reaction time because you would be able to process what you're going to do before. Does that make sense? It's almost like it's like anticipation, except it is allowing for processing to occur before the stimulus is presented. So it allows for early preparation or early action preparation. Interestingly, if you took a participant and altered their attention, you made them like concentrate on something else, the reaction time would revert back, and then the stimulus happens. Okay, here's the hint. Okay, there's your, and then move their attention, and then they go, and then they forgot the hint, and they go back to, usually it's a light that they have, like a colored light in it. Each color responds to, or is associated with a different response. If they lost their attention after the hint, they lose the processing of the, they lose the advanced processing of the skill. How many of you have tried to use someone else's stove? Because the next example of a variable they found sort of influenced our reaction time is stimulus response compatibility. So how many of you have like have come home after a long night of partying and wanting to make, I don't know, like this craft dinner stove thing? You got to figure out how to use a stove or someone else's stove. And so when you gotta look at the diagram and then like try to figure out where the burner is and which one is associated with which, it's always like sort of an issue, right? That's an example of stimulus response compatibility. So when the stimulus is presented in a way that more closely resembles the response required, it decreases reaction time because it decreases the amount of processing. Here's another example of that, and this is what we're going to do in the lab, is a Stroop effect. So in this case, it's not like a spatial stimulus response compatibility. It's trying to read out words that are colors. Oh, who wants to do this? Let's do it. Will this show up if let's see here. Stop presenting. The Stroop effect demonstrates that when my entire screen, here. Yeah, see this. it's going to cut back. Can you all see me? If I go, or well, not see me, but can you all see the screen if I cut back to it? This is an example of this Stroop effect. So what it states is that when you're trying to read the colors of words, but the color of the word is incongruent with the wording. So for example, in this case, you're wanting to say the color of the word, not what the word would say. So in this case, see how it says red? You want to say the color of the word, and it's actually blue. When the color and the word are compatible, my reaction time in being able to say the word is less than when they're incongruent. So let's watch. So it's going to measure the amount of time that I have to get through to say the word. So red, green, blue, yellow, pink, orange, blue, green, blue, white, green, yellow, orange, blue, white, brown, red, blue, yellow, green, pink, yellow, green, blue, red. So that took 12.8 seconds. Now, let's see what happens when the color doesn't match the word. Green, yellow, white, pink, orange, blue, red, yellow, green, blue, red, blue, green, red, pink, blue, yellow, my brain, pink, green, orange, red, blue, pink, what's orange maybe? Blue, red, and green. Oh, so yeah. So anyway, I need rehab now. Did anyone else try it? That would be a maybe. So the stove and the Stroop effect are different examples of this whole idea of stimulus response compatibility. Am I frozen? I'm frozen. Can you guys see me? Am I frozen? Let's try again. No. Is it working or no? Everyone? Crap. Let's try this again. Let me log out and log back in, okay? How about now? Sorry about that. I just switching and stuff just ruined it for Firefox. But let's just finish up the lecture. So do we all understand this whole idea of stimulus response compatibility? If they're incongruent, it would just require more processing time. So in terms of action preparation, it would require more processing of the brain. So let's finish off with some of the other things that we're sort of evaluated to affect reaction time in action preparation. There was a specific for period. So you know when you get like a race and there's a warning sign and then the go sign? When there is a regularity between the warning and then the go signal, like the amount of time is consistent, you can anticipate. So then you can start processing ahead of time. This study was interesting in that you had a demonstration that movement complexity increases reaction time. So they had participants choosing or having to do either a 3-part movement or a 6-part movement, the 6th part being more difficult. When the signal came up, they had to do the 6th part, the reaction time, or the 6-part movement, the reaction time was increased. So depending on the complexity of the movement that is required, would it require more processing? Makes sense. Same thing with accuracy. So when the movement that is required needs to be more accurate, it increases reaction time, so therefore increases action preparation. You probably have to constrain your body to more specific things. And then when you have, let's say, in darts, let's say you're throwing darts repeatedly, the reaction time to go from the first repetition, it slowly decreases if you're completely repeating the same skill or same trial. So if you're doing it in quick succession, the reaction time would slowly decrease up to a point, and that's because you've already pre-processed it. So you're just re-implementing the same motor program you've already sort of completed. And then the last one is the time between different responses to different signals. That sounds super weird, but this whole idea is the concept of what's called a psychological refractory period. What that means is that, have you ever played sports where the best thing you want to do as an offensive player is fake out the defender? It buys you more time to get around them. What the psychological refractory period indicates is that when you get someone to bite on a movement, they've prepared that movement and have to sort of, like, once they've initiated movement, that motor program has to almost like go to completion before they can react. So if I'm playing basketball with someone and I'm like follow through is when you're doing a motor skill. When, let's say I'm playing with you, Zafir, and I am dribbling and I want to get around you. So I'm going to either drive to the left or to the right, but I'm going to try to fake. By me faking, let's say I go to the left and then you bite on it, and then I go to the right, you're going to stumble and then I can get around you, correct? And the reason is that you've implemented a movement, and so you got to carry it out a little bit before your brain can go through with, reacting to the fact that I'm going right and then interacting. And the way that they did this study was super interesting because they looked at the reaction type of when a player goes to the left or to the right, so there's no fake. So if I go to the left, they calculated the reaction time. So whether I went to the left or to the right, your reaction time, Zafir, was, I don't know, 0.1 seconds, let's say, right? Let's say it was 1 second. 1 second reaction time in each. So if I faked, you would start movement, and then I went to the right, and then you would follow through. So you would anticipate that once I started moving, your reaction time would be, when I started to move to the right, 1 second. What they find is the reaction time has increased because there's an amount of time before the body, because it had already implemented one motor program. There's a refractory period where it needs to follow through with the motion it initiated before it can create a second one. Does that make sense, everyone? No, it would be more that once I've decided I want to move and implemented or initiated that movement, all of that processing information being sent out has to it's already been completed. So there's a refractory period before you can sort of reconfigure and re-put together another motor program. Does that make sense? And then the last couple of slides is looking at what are some internal characteristics that will affect reaction time or influence preparation. So up to this point, we had been analyzing and describing different variables of the external environment that affect our reaction time or action preparation. What about if there were changing internal aspects of the participant or the performer? How would that affect reaction or action preparation? What they found was that this whole idea of the alertness of the performer, so how alert they are, will affect reaction time. And so we all know, like air traffic controllers and truck drivers, there's a certain amount of time that they're allowed to work before they need to take a break, because they have to maintain their alertness to be able to react to things on the road or in the airport. That comes from the idea that when you have to maintain vigilance, you slowly decrease alertness over time because it takes effort to maintain alertness. So depending on how alert they are, you would have an effect of reaction time. Maintaining alertness for a long time would increase the reaction time or make it worse. When you have a warning signal, it sort of homes in, it kind of gives them a warning, and it sort of increases the alertness. So by having warning signals, you're decreasing reaction time. You're improving the alertness of the participant. But there's only a certain effect. So if I give a warning signal that the stimulus is going to happen, that alertness increase only happens for 1 to 4 seconds, and then it resets. Have we talked about choking yet? The idea of choking in sports? Okay. So we're going to talk about this next day, and so I'll get into it there. But when you have your attention focused on the signal, your reaction time decreases than when you're focused on your movements. So if you are trying to process and consciously trying to think about all the different movements required, if you are sort of focusing in on your movements, then just go, because it's like more things, more processing, it tends to increase your reaction time or require more processing. So just finishing off with this last slide, we've talked about the changes in processing required from all these different variables. What are the different things that you think are occurring? What types of things can you tell me are probably occurring in that action preparation time? They're all listed on this slide, but depending on the skill, there is sort of the distance, what the movement that's required. Maybe if there's number of choices, which of the choices is required. target distance. There's all types of processing that has to be occurring in the brain. And so these are sort of the examples of the processing that must be occurring in the different skills that we've talked about. And that's occurring during action preparation. Looking at it from a motor control perspective, when we, so this is based on sort of motor control research that I was involved in, we're looking at sort of the activation of muscles when a motor task is being completed. And so if we had so in this study, what they had people doing was they had to place their foot on a step. And so what they were told was that they had to place their foot on a step and back down, or they had to place it with the intent of stepping up and going up the stairs. So on the go signal, they would tell you you're going to step up or you're just going to place. And so what they looked at was the way that the muscles were activated. And instinctively, when they were told that they were going to be placing their foot for stepping, to step up onto a stair, the muscle activation pattern was different. The core muscles were activated in a way for balance. And so that's something that's happening during that action preparation stage. Your body is processing, what movement is going to be required, and so how to activate your postural muscles. And we know from neuroscience, or intramovement neuroscience, that's happening in the premotor cortex. The supplementary motor cortex was involved in sort of the sequencing of movements. So in that action preparation stage, when we're doing sequence movements like piano playing, we know that the brain is processing what's going to be happening next and will alter our movement based on that. So I don't know if I used this example before, but when we're going to play the piano, if a high note is coming up, the musician will alter their hand position because they know that high note is coming up. So clearly that's occurring in the processing time. And then the last thing is rhythmicity preparation. And this is from the evaluation of athletes before they go and complete their sport. What do we notice in golfers or people that are playing tennis or basketball players? When they go to do a free throw, what do most basketball players do before they do a free throw? They practice their move, or golfers will do like a couple practice swings before they complete the golf shot. Tennis people they'll practice, right, before they go and they do the tennis serve. They're doing what are called these pre-performance rituals. So what do you think that the athletes are doing in this case? They're practicing the rhythm of their movements. And so that must be happening internally. Your body is processing the rhythm required, right? And we know that the rhythm of movement is being stored in terms of the coordination at the cerebellum. Oops, I just screwed that up. And that's it. So again, I know that was a lot, but hopefully I presented it in a way that you will understand sort of the basis of the lecture, and then you can sort of read around. Don't forget that next week is reading week, and then we have another lecture, and then the midterm. So what I advise everyone to do, for those of you that are in the synchronous lecture today, or those that are watching online, watch the lecture, go through the slides and focus on what I'm talking about, get the sort of the backbone of the lecture, and then read around those slides, and then you can accumulate that information. Nothing in itself is very difficult. It's all very common sense. It's just a lot. So it can be overwhelming initially, but as you go through it, then it starts to really condense. And you'll find is that the same principles are true of all of the different, like for all the different motor skills that they talked about. They all found that vision was responsible for the same sort of things. They just proved it. Any questions before we go, everyone? Yes, that's true. For Zafir, yes, the quiz can be open and closed as needed. Okay, awesome. Have a great week, everyone. If you need anything, feel free to email me or contact me. And then have enjoyable reading week. And then we'll talk to you 2 weeks.